Hello, hello. Okay, I think we're live. Um, Sunday evening, kind of late, 9:20, just being a bit of a night owl. Um, so we're going to talk about Vertigo. Now, normally I tell you it doesn't matter all that much. You hear my lecture first and then go back to what I lecture about, or look at what I'm going to lecture about and then listen to my lecture. But this time I'm going to recommend that you see the movie before you listen to this tape, because obviously this tape will be full of spoilers. And the way Vertigo is set up, I'll tell you this much before getting a chance to pause and watch the movie. An hour and 20 minutes into this movie, you're going to discover something that will change the way you view everything that you've seen that last hour and 20 minutes. And it then the film continues another 48 minutes where you see the consequences of what really happened that you didn't understand at first and how that's playing out for the characters in the movie. So another way to put this is that for the first hour and 20 minutes, you are suturing with the character played by Jimmy Stewart, a detective named Scotty, and he's your point of reference, and he's got a mystery he's trying to solve. He's getting pulled into this situation. He's trying to figure out what is going on, and he'll get in over his head, and you'll see that, and he'll witness kind of a tragedy, personal tragedy, probably a general tragedy, which completely destroys him. He winds up briefly in an institution. So here come some of the spoilers. So go ahead and pause now if you haven't seen it yet. That's good enough. If you can't or you don't, then yeah, I mean, you can watch. This movie is made to be rewatched. There's no question about that, and not just once, and not necessarily to figure out what happened. This movie, 1959, is cinematically speaking one of the closest things I've ever seen to Waiting for Godot. It's not this. I don't mean to panic you. It's not a movie where nothing happens twice. There's love, there's intrigue, there's sexual attraction, there's murder, there's plenty. But in terms of the loop, a kind of loop where we're shown people who create meaning for themselves, create realities, make choices based on those realities, make decisions intended to defend those realities. That all of it is a giant speech by Lucky somehow, and even when that's exposed, uh, the, the the desperation to sort through the fragments and you put it together again into what it was before, or somehow through the despair of not being able to do that, reformulate a new reality, even if it's one based on regret and nostalgia. Okay, so I'm done with not spoiling it. Okay, all right, turn it off if you haven't seen the movie. Come back. All right, now now I'm gonna ignore whether I do spoilers or not. And I partly say that because I'll be curious. I'll be really curious to know how long, what levels of deception were played upon you. I think I first saw this movie on late night TV when I was at like 10, maybe 12. So I vaguely remember trying to sort through the shock of realizing that what I just seen couldn't have been what actually happened. And back then, they didn't even have videotapes yet, so I couldn't rewind. I couldn't see it again. I think it was another 20 years before Vertigo was released again into the theaters. It was given a re-release, not having been seen in some time. And I went back to see it at around your age, 24, and uh, you know, remembered my childhood viewing. But boy, there's a big difference between uh, well, where was I? I don't know, whatever I was, 20s, late 20s, maybe a big difference between 10 and late 20s as far as desire and crushes and love and romance and sexuality. So I knew I knew the reveal that second time I saw it after so many years in between, but it was still, you when you've seen Vertigo, ready to see Vertigo. because the vertigo you'll see isn't the one you're seeing. And I know this sounds impossible, but that's part of Hitchcock's point, is that particularly when it comes to the visual, and which he was such a genius, telling stories with images, we make sense of what we see. But really, all we're doing is we're constantly projecting the sense that we wish to be onto what we claim to see. And I've said this before, that begins to affect what we're able to see. And we saw that in the most photographed barn in America, where Murray says, you know, nobody sees the barn, because everybody has arrived in a kind of herd mentality to vaguely photograph some kind of murky sense of America's origin, which of course isn't true, since that farmland would have been, you know, lived on by natives, and the barn is pure commodity. All evidence of the labor that went into producing the barn, or the labor of the farmers who worked on the barn, or the act and the event of clearing the land, not only of trees but of indigenous people, putting them on reservations. All of that is gone, and that's that's the difference between a myth of origin and history. History, as I said before in this class, or the other, or maybe both, history is what hurts, and what hurts is nowhere indicated by a barn that is obsessively photographed. And Vertigo is about the past in a way too. And now I'm going to narrate the story for you to a degree. And you've seen the movie, but even having seen the movie, you may well still be puzzling over some of the gaps. I mean, it's a tribute to how much this movie pulls you into fantasy / reality relationships, and definitely you can think about the balcony a lot when you think about Vertigo. I just said it's a lot like Godot. It seems perfect for this class. It also makes the top 3 best movies ever made on almost everybody's list, along with Citizen Kane and some others. Once again, was not hugely successful, even though he was Hitchcock by then, 1959. He was a famous director, hadn't done The Birds or Psycho, or even North by Northwest. Now, he might have done North by Northwest. That might have been the movie before this. But so he was a very well-known director, and Jimmy Stewart was one of America's favorite actors. So there was no problem with box office draw, but it wasn't seen as Hitchcock's best. It didn't seem to make the impact at the time. But I can't think of any other movie that has grown in stature over the years. Even Citizen Kane, which was muted at the time, people understood that Wells had crafted something amazing. Now, maybe because they expected Hitchcock's technique. No one had ever seen a movie by Wells before. He'd never made one before. He was 24 years old, the age that Kim Novak is when she played this Judy Madeline role. So Wells came out of nowhere, and there were certain techniques he used, like deep focus became kind of his signature form in a manner that not even Hitchcock had exploited that much. So Wells really did make a splash. But with Hitchcock, it was like, you know, it was hard for him to outdo himself, movie after movie, and then he never got an Academy Award for Best Director, which is, you know, pretty shocking. He got a Lifetime Achievement Award. Rebecca, his first American movie, because he was born and raised in London, and the first 8 or 9 of his movies were made in England, and of course Hollywood was always on the lookout for talent. So they brought Hitchcock over to America, put him in Selznick Studios in Hollywood, bought a very huge bestseller, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and said, you know, make a movie of Rebecca. And then he had legendary fights with Selznick, who really wanted the movie to go like the book, because that's the safest box office approach. But Hitchcock doesn't care that much about his source material, other than how it inspires him. So you can see him getting some things into, like Rebecca, but it got to a point where Selznick would demand to see rushes of the kind of scenes that Selznick had written, and Hitchcock would film them, and he just would cut them later. And in some cases, he would even stage a scene for Selznick, who would come witness it being filmed, and it wasn't even filmed in the camera. Hitchcock had no intention of using it. So this wiliness of Hitchcock, the way he could play the studio system, is it's sort of in his movies too. He's a magician. The sleight of hand is second nature to him. He can make Selznick think that he saw a clip that never goes into the movie. He can make Selznick think he's watching a scene being filmed, which there's no film in the cameras. It's not really a scene being filmed. It's just what he thinks. And Hitchcock was able to play Selznick kind of like a fiddle in that way, because Selznick was like a lot of those studio guys. He had a colossal ego and massive insecurity, sort of constantly at war with each other, kind of Trumpian in that way. And just like Hitchcock can do with his audience, he knew how to create a reality for Selznick that would keep Selznick from being able to control him, Hitchcock. Okay, so all that's a kind of a production aside, but important. Vertigo, that was 1940, and it was his first Hollywood film. By the time in 1959, he was enough of a filmmaker that to virtually get final cut. He was interfered with less because he was Hitchcock, and people expected he by then had a very successful television show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, with 30-minute stories, some of which he directed, most of which were directed by others, but they were introduced by him. He became a sort of a household icon. He had a very droll sense of humor, and he would introduce the domesticity of murder. And originally, he didn't think he'd be able to get Psycho made, his most famous movie, perhaps, as a movie, and he was going to cut it down to 30 minutes and put it on the TV show. But then he decided to, because the studios weren't willing to fund the full-length movie with a plot like Psycho, and he finally took a chance and decided to invest a fair amount of his own money, enough to do a feature movie and not just the TV show. And a lot of the money that he used to pay for Psycho came from the revenue that the TV show generated. So it allowed him to, in a sense, be an independent filmmaker for Psycho, 1960, shot in black and white, partly he learned his craft shooting in black and white. Hitchcock's first movies were done in the 1920s in London and in Berlin, and they were silent. Movies were silent until 1929, 1930, and 1931, depending on which country you're talking about. Those years were strange. Sometimes they would shoot the movie silent, and then they would shoot it again with sound for different markets. The apparatus that allowed movies to have sound was quite awkward at the time. The movie cameras themselves were very loud, so that there were huge challenges to make a so-called talkie. But the first thing to know about Hitchcock is he really never stopped making silent movies. And again, don't be alarmed. Vertigo has a soundtrack that has a full dialogue, but it doesn't. It would certainly lose a lot if you took away the soundtrack, and it would lose something if you took away the dialogue, but not. It would still make sense. You can run Vertigo as a silent movie, or certainly run it with just a soundtrack. And in fact, there's one sequence in Vertigo after this. Jimmy Stewart's character Johnny has been hired by a worried husband to follow his wife around, because his wife seems to have been somehow possessed by the specter of her dead grandmother, who had committed suicide several generations ago, and now seems to be possessing his wife Madeline, and she's acting strangely, and he doesn't know the husband doesn't know where she goes all day, and the odometer reads it has been hundreds of miles, and he needs a detective to follow her around. He doesn't want to go to an institution until he has a better idea what is going on. And so the first sequence where Stewart is following her, it's 14 minutes of film and there's no dialogue. That's 14 minutes without a break where there's no dialogue. So Psycho also is almost a third of Psycho is silent, with the exception of this soundtrack. So Hitchcock really tells a story with the directing, with the editing, with the framing, with the cuts as he moves from one thing to another. And I'm finishing the class. We'll have kind of two classes. It sounds like we're going to have 2 weeks on Vertigo, because usually I show Vertigo in class, and that takes up a class, so to speak, and then I lecture on it in the following class. But since you're seeing it on your own, that means we've got 2 blocks of time to talk about it, 2 open classrooms, and Lord knows it more than can take up that amount of time. Plus, it's the capstone offering in my class. I mean, I've actually gone back in time a little. White Noise was 1985. This is 1959. The Balcony was 1958. But this to me is another masterpiece of the full ramifications of postmodernism. And personally, Hitchcock, of course, lived through World War One. He was born in 1899, so he was close. He was around 20 during World War One, uh, and then in his 40s and beginning to be well known for World War Two. And he actually went to the concentration camps at the request of both the British and the American government, and filmed some of the footage, some of the Holocaust footage. So, I mean, he was, in terms of the things we've been talking about in this class, he literally was at the concentration camps filming, and a lot of what he was asked to do initially is England was trying to figure out how to recondition, if you will, Germany. Hitler was dead, the war was over, but Nazism had reigned for almost 2 decades. And while there were plenty of Germans who were never down with Nazism, there were plenty more who, not unlike what we saw with Trump, it was too painful to imagine that their Messiah. I mean, you think Trump did things that were bad, and he kind of did. He was nothing compared to Hitler. So it was like, how do we get Germany back into Europe? And so they wanted to show the Germans how bad Hitler was, but they didn't know how to go about it exactly. They were afraid that if they just sort of tried to rub their faces in it, that would just further alienate and make them angry or depressed or resistant. So they asked Hitchcock to see if there was some way he could to film the concentration camps, to let the Germans know that this was being done in their name, but do it in such a way that they'd have some kind of space. And in fact, they never showed what Hitchcock filmed, although you can find it sometimes. It comes on YouTube, some of the footage that Hitchcock shot, because in the end they couldn't wrap their head around how to use the movie to do that. So they relied more on pamphlets, and I think in the end they just were afraid of the power of the image. And Hitchcock, try though he might, it is very hard. There's no way to present the concentration camp diplomatically. And so his footage is scorching. It's not just because he's a good filmmaker, but I mean, he puts you there, and that's unbearable already. So anyway, Hitchcock saw the depths, the bottom, and with Vertigo, to tell you the story, when there's a policeman, and the movie opens, and I'm going to show you some of the clips, but I'm just going to narrate some of this so we can get on the same image. It opens with an iron bar bisecting the frame, so it's sort of signified. It's like the beginning of the movie. Before that, we have the credits, all of which come out of a woman's eye. And they come out in a vertiginous, swirling way. And we know this is going to be a movie about a man who's going to have an emotional crisis in relation to a woman. And Hitchcock himself said that this is a movie about a man in emotional crisis. So, but it opens first. You see this iron bar, then 2 hands clasp the bar. Then this man essentially climbs into the frame of the movie, and he's running, and then we hear a gunshot, and we see that they're running across rooftops in San Francisco, and the second person to jump onto the sloped roof, because the thief jumps onto a slope roof, slides back a little bit, gets to the top, and goes on. Next man coming along as a policeman, he makes the leap to the roof, also slips slightly, moves on. Then Jimmy Stewart, as the detective, comes. He's the third one, makes the leap, and then loses traction, slides all the way, and just manages to grab the edge of the gutter. And so he's hanging, I don't know, 20 stories in the air, uh, hanging onto a gutter, which is already bending, and he seems frozen. So the policeman stops chasing the thief, who literally runs off screen, and we never see him again. He's got nothing to do with the movie somehow. And this movie does this a lot, and Hitchcock does this a lot. There are things that don't stay in the frame, and we keep trying to figure out what's the story that we're watching. Is this the story of a thief who's running away? Is it, or the policeman who catches him, or the detective who figured out the crime? It's not any of those. It's that this third man running after them is going to have an emotional crisis. And the movie, some people have called it the first and only mainstream surrealist movie, because it seems that at one and the same time, this is a realistic scene, but it also seems a visual telling of falling into an emotional crisis. It's going to be a movie about falling in love. It's going to be a movie about falling out of love. It's a falling, and there'll be a lot of people actually falling in this movie. But Vertigo, as the title suggests, seems to be that abyss that we all try to bridge with our sense of self, with the subjectivity we try to maintain, with the way we relate to other people to sustain that subjectivity. This movie is obsessed with bridges. The Golden Gate Bridge, of course, in San Francisco, one of the most famous bridges in the world. And there's a scene where his former girlfriend is drawing pictures of a strapless bra, which she tells him is based on the physics of a cantilever bridge. So suspending the woman's physique, and that will become important because Midge, his former girlfriend, who he doesn't feel any sexual attraction for, she wears a bra, obviously, and yet when he meets the wife of Gavin Elster, whom he's supposed to be following around, and sees her the first time in her evening dress, she's wearing the strapless gown. So part of this is, men using their fantasies of women to keep themselves suspended over the void of their own incertitude. And the performance, then we've seen this with Barbie, we've seen this with Esther's rebellion against needing to be the one that the man's allowed to shoot off like an arrow, and she gets left behind, and she sees the role Mrs. Willard plays, so that Buddy's dad can have his role. Sylvia Plath saw her own mother do that, and there's a Godot-esque quality to this. Certainly Jimmy Stewart's love, as he starts to fall in love with this woman he's trailing, who is married. He's to Gavin Elster, the man who hired him to follow her around. His falling in love is also a falling apart, and I guess that's the two things this movie is about. It's about falling in love, it's about falling apart, and it's about how there isn't any difference in a way. Like, we're all falling, always, all the time. The issue is, let me put this a different way. We're all always suspended over the void of our own incertitude. And then we have different ways of building bridges to sustain us as we move back and forth across this void. So your grade point average is a bridge between you and the uncertainty of your own future. You may not know what your future is, but you don't know what your future is, but that 3.8 is the bridge that you're standing on. And so you can look back from where you started moving out across the void, the beginning of your university career, and you can look ahead and see it, and you can see the bridge. But what you don't want is a pier. You don't, it's very, very uncanny and terrifying to see a bridge where part of it's collapsed, because now it does. You just will fall off. Or if you're on the bridge when it collapses, you're helpless. You're completely helpless. You can't hold up a bridge that you're standing on. And in some ways, love is presented that way, that when we're in love with someone and they're in love with us, well, as a couple that's in love, we're both each other's suspension bridges over the void of incertitude. But for both of us, both bridges could go down simultaneously, or one bridge could go down while the other doesn't. But the reality is that love is giving to someone what you don't have yourself, in the hopes that they'll give you what you need, which they will, but they don't have it either. There's a balcony-esque, who's the judge, who's the thief? One minute the thief is begging the judge for mercy. The next minute the judge is kissing the foot of the thief. Yes, power is an effective relationship. We've seen that at the political level quite a bit, but in terms of interpersonal relationships, power is not so much a political operative. It's more that we become dependent on somebody else to secure our bridge, and they become dependent on us to secure their bridge. And that's how a mutually reciprocal romance, perhaps. But one reason romances are so sensitive is that we can't our own bridge. We need somebody else to hold up the other end of our bridge, and they need us to hold up the other end of their bridge. So we're not completely in control of whether our bridge collapses or not, because we've given over the holding of it to someone else, and they could drop it, and we could drop ours. And that's another reason, is a thin line between love and hate. So love is kind of terrifying in that way. It's exhilarating and it's terrifying. It's exhilarating to find someone who says, I want to hold your bridge. And you say, well, I want to hold your bridge. I love you too. And that's great. But now there's a dependency there that requires trust, integrity, everything. And there's an over 50% divorce rate, and breaking up is hard to do, because standing on your bridge that breaks up and starts plunging into the void is terrifying. And the problem is that, when you don't have someone you love or who is currently in love with you, then you have other ways of sustaining yourself. One reason love's so exhilarating is it's a way you almost never imagined. That it's a bridge you never imagined. It's a splendid bridge, and it's so much better than any bridge you've ever seen before. But it's also much more precarious, because it really does depend on another person, and that's why it's exhilarating. It's exhilarating to depend on someone else who is there for you, and it's terrifying to depend on someone else who isn't, or who says they are but aren't, all of those things, or who was there for a while but then left. So that's partly what this movie is about. Scotty collapses on that roof. Now, and we can read that a lot of different ways. He could have had an emotional collapse on the job. The event we saw, probably, maybe it happened. But the point is, he's afraid he retires. And so the very next scene after he falls is in Midge's office with Mozart playing, and everything is very safe, but he's still high in the air. It's just now he's inside this safe room, and Midge seems to represent safety to him, but certainly not passion. She seems to love him. And they have a somewhat tense exchange about how we used to be engaged, and Jimmy Stewart might be all jokey about it, but you can tell it mattered to her, and there was something about the breakup. Like he said, I seem to recall we were engaged. Well, she certainly recalls it. And then he says, how long were we engaged? Because of course he does remember, but he's minimizing it. And she says 3 weeks. And then Hitchcock goes into a high, downward, tight close-up of her. And she looks like a watchful cat. Like this conversation is tiptoeing through a graveyard where there may still be real ghosts for her. And whereas he wants to just put it all down to some funny thing, well, I'm still available, and she lets him say all this, and she's obviously like, well, I wish you were. You seem completely unavailable to me as anything except a buddy. And this is the trade-off that Midge has made, is that she would like to be in a romantic relationship with Johnny. He won't, can't, didn't. But he's perfectly happy to have her as a support of some kind. And the kind that she is pretty clearly, and this is very Hitchcockian, is she's rather maternal. When she's like, so, why retire? And he says, oh, Midge, don't be so motherly. And we get another tight. And she doesn't like that she's motherly, but it's the only role that he's allows her. And the compromise she's made is that she loves him and she's willing to be with him on his terms, which, although he wouldn't admit this, seems to be where he's the slightly naughty boy and she is the over cautious mother who hovers above him. And he ridicules her for doing this, but he's set this up, and he'll do the same thing with Madeline Elster, Gavin Elster's wife. He'll position her in the way that he needs to have her, hold up his suspension bridge. So they have that whole conversation about the Rosier and all the rest of it, and then he says, by the way, do you remember Gavin Elster from the college days? She goes, no, you'd think I would. I don't. And he's like, yeah, I don't know. Got a note from him, says he wants to see me, and then he reads the address, and she says, well, that's Skid Row, isn't it? And he's like, yeah, well, I'm on the bum. Not jokingly again. I'll go have a drink. And this introduces a leitmotif, I'll point out, of alcoholism. It's Hitchcock struggled with drinking, and it's possible that you can fall off the wagon, another kind of falling. And is that what that rooftop scene also visualizes? Being forced to take a leave of absence or even to retire because your drinking problem has made you a danger. Because he does say, I have to retire. What if it happens again? I'm a danger. I would be a danger to whoever was depending on me. And when he goes to see Elster, he makes that joke about how he can't drink. You can't have a drink at the top of the Mark, which is a famous San Francisco hotel, but there are plenty of bars at street level. And then Elster says, would you like a drink now? And Stewart glances at his watch. He goes, no, it's a little early for me. And that's the first sinister note we get from Gavin Elster, because Gavin Elster is a villain, as we will discover. And it's another surreal moment that, Midge can't even remember this guy's name. Stewart doesn't remember his name. He makes the false assumption that he must be on the bum because of his address, but in fact, yes, there's rough neighborhood maybe at the base of this office, but in fact, he's got a huge shipbuilding. And he says, yeah, well, I married into it. It's my wife's shipbuilding. It's rather dull. And you can see in the window behind him the cranes swinging back and forth. So the first note of menace that creeps in is that he offers Scotty a drink. And the second thing is that I was sorry to read about that incident in the paper. Are you all right? And that's when he says, yeah, I'm fine. I just can't drink, and that's a second note of menace if we're really paying attention, because we're going to discover later that he's setting up Scotty. And part of what he needs is somebody who's afraid of heights, because he has a murder plot that he wants to kill his wife because he wants her money. He wants to sell the shipbuilding and be a wealthy man on his own. So how is he going to kill his wife? So I'll jump ahead and plot. And this is a complete spoiler. He's been having an affair with a woman named Judy Barton, and he's persuaded her to dress up as his wife. His wife lives outside of San Francisco and doesn't come to town, so nobody really sees her, so she dresses up like her, and then he concocts this story with Scotty. You have to follow her around because I'm afraid she's going to kill herself. But Judy is pretending to be the suicidal Mrs. Elster, but in fact she's Gavin's mistress, possibly former mistress. It's not even clear. She may still be his mistress, and she's been taught. Her job is to lure Scotty into buying this story that she's either mentally ill or possessed, because the plan is that at a certain point, when Johnny thinks he's finally figured out why she feels haunted, because she tells him about a tower that she dreamed of. And she and Gavin have already decided where this tower is. And he says, well, we'll drive there. I remember that one. I know what we're talking about. This is a real place. We're going to go there. And he's all excited that he's got this clue. And what he doesn't know is that Gavin Elster has broken the neck of his wife now and dragged her already up the stairs to the top of the tower. So Gavin Elster's already at the top of the tower with his dead wife, with her broken neck. And Judy, who's been pretending and whom he believes is Madeline Elster, breaks away from him and starts running up the stairs. And now we see why Gavin Elster needed someone who was afraid of heights, because then he's counting on the fact that Scotty won't be able to get all the way to the top of the bell tower where he would see Gavin Elster. He would see the dead wife in the arms. Instead, what he sees, he's halfway up the tower and he hears a scream, and then the body of a blonde woman in a gray suit goes flashing past the window to his right, and then he looks out the window and there's Madeline, the woman he's been trailing and whom he's fallen in love with and who has fallen in love with him, and they've already embraced and kissed and possibly spent the night, well, not on screen. And after, he's so traumatized that he just leaves. He doesn't even go to check the body, or he would have discovered that Gavin Elster threw his dead wife's body at the right moment. It was Judy playing Madeline who screamed, which actually wasn't part of Gavin's plot. She actually claims that she went upstairs to stop it, although what's that mean? The wife's already dead. I don't know how she's going to stop it then. So then, of course, the coroner has the inquiry. The made-for-order murder, even though the coroner is very castigating of him, but he basically says, Scotty failed at a key moment. There's nothing legally that holds him responsible for the death of Madeline Elster. The husband took precautions, thought he was hiring a good detective. We know that's not true. I mean, there's some weird moments there that the coroner is very much on Gavin Elster's side. I almost wonder if he's been paid off or something, but because it isn't the case that Gavin made a smart choice, and knowing that his wife was suicidal and made a suicidal attempt already, jumping, granted, not from the Golden Gate Bridge, which would have made more sense, except it would have actually killed her. So instead, she only jumps in a couple of feet. And Scotty doesn't notice that. Like, if this is a real suicide attempt, who just steps off into water and floats? What kind of a suicide attempt is that? But he's so convinced in his own mind at that point that caring for her and rescuing her and being the strong man who saves her will save him, that he dismisses red flags, like there's something wrong, and why hire me? Why can't Gavin Elster either follow his own wife around, or, well, I guess he could argue, well, she'll see me, she'll know what I look like. So there's all these kind of superficial reasons why what Gavin Elster does makes sense, but they don't stand up to scrutiny. But Scotty doesn't want to scrutinize them. He's looking, for reasons we don't quite know, he's a scared little boy. Midge knows it. And Midge doesn't love the fact that she can't help taking advantage of that. Like when he decides to, as he says, I think I can lick this. And notice that he pulls out what looks like a child's high chair. And he goes up a step and he's fine. He goes up a step, he's fine. He goes up another step. And he swoons and faints, like in a kind of Victorian womanly faint, into Midge's arms, and she's thrilled to be holding him and saying, "Oh, Johnny!" But you can see by her face that it's also, she too is frustrated. Like, I only get to be with him if I'm maternal and not sexual. I only get to hold him if he passes out in terror or through a panic attack. So she's kind of addicted to him in a way where, when he says, how come you've never gotten married? And how's your love life? She's like, normal. And so we're to understand that she's allowed to date, but it seems pretty clear that she doesn't and can't or won't, because she can't let go of her own fantasy that Johnny would somehow be hers. There's a scene late in the movie where Judy is trying to get Johnny to pay attention to her as Judy. because to jump ahead in the plot, what will happen is he goes into an institution. Midge comes to visit him and says, "Oh, Johnny, you think you're lost, but you're not. Mother is here," which is pretty creepy. But then you can also tell she kind of gives up. A very, very sad, beautiful hallway shot. After she tells the doctor, by the way, he's in love with someone, and he's still in love with her, and I don't think that's going to help at all. You can see the defeat on her face, that she's not a part of his life anymore. And we don't know it at the time, but she does a very long, slow walk down the corridor. And she walks out of the film too, just like the thief. We never find out. We never see her again. Scotty never asks about her. In a way, everybody in this movie seems to be haunting the movie. Like, are they there? Is Carlotta's grandmother really possessing her? Is Judy? Where's Judy when she's being Madeline? Mrs. Elster we never meet. So she's alive for the first part of the movie, and then she gets killed off screen. And the only time we even quote see her is when we get a filmed flashback from Judy's point of view of what really happened when she arrived at the top of the bell tower. What the scene we couldn't see because Hitchcock restricted us to Scotty's disability. It's kind of a classic use of the cinema audience, that we are disabled. We can't climb a tower unless the director lets us. The director decides whether we have vertigo or not, and the director decides whether what the scene that we're seeing in front of us is the reality that we're being persuaded that it is, while it is in fact something else, which makes the important point that Gavin Elster is a director, that Gavin Elster is one version of Hitchcock. And when you look at his office, it looks like a studio office, and the cranes in the background, although they're supposed to be part of a shipbuilding yard, and that would make sense, but it also looks like a Hollywood lot, which would have had cranes. In order to engineer a lot of the crane shots that Hitchcock himself used, they had heavy equipment in Hollywood lots that could swing cameras around and raise them up very high. It's a super high crane shot after Madeline jumps, or rather Mrs. Elster's thrown onto the roof. We go into this massive crane shot, and we see Johnny exiting. He looks like a little tiny ant at the bottom. So literally those cranes you see waving around out there are going to be used to make the movie that you're watching. And also Hitchcock, Kim Novak was virtually an unknown actress. She was somewhat up and coming. She'd been in one or two movies, one with Frank Sinatra. She was certainly being noticed as a sexy, beautiful, possibly talented actress, but not very well known. And Hitchcock was known for making stars of his leading ladies. So Gavin Elster makes a star out of Kim Novak, but it's really Hitchcock who then has his alter ego, Gavin Elster, making Kim Novak a Hollywood star, playing. He takes Kim Novak and makes her Kim Novak in the same way that Gavin Elster takes Judy and makes her Madeline. And Kim Novak is neither Judy nor Madeline, but the people who watch the movie, us, also tend to fall in love with Judy or Madeline or some version of the two. And obviously having crushes on Hollywood stars, male and female, was basic to the industry, whether it was Cary Grant or Brad Pitt or whoever. And Brad Pitt's getting too old for you guys now, I suppose. I'm not quite sure who the new one of those guys named Chris. I can't keep them apart. But maybe that's the new matinee idol. They kind of come and go, and Scarlett Johansson, I guess it has been a reigning. Certainly Hitchcock, I'm almost certain, would have cast her in a role, so he would have loved to have a chance to make her one of his icy blondes, which he practically specialized in. And Tippi Hedren had only been in one soda commercial when he hired her to do The Birds, and made a star out of her as well. And one gets the feeling that Hitchcock also played out over and over again, building up these stars and then watching them drop away, because he was married, he had a daughter, and and while many of these actresses, Grace Kelly is another famous blonde that he worked with, many of them loved him, but as a father figure. And for the most, as far as we know, most of the time, with the exception of some stories we hear, he honored that barrier, although it seemed to get definitely got slippery with Tippi Hedren, at least in her own sense. That it wasn't full on Harvey Weinstein stuff, but it was definitely blurring the line there of his wanting. And he was quite a bit older then too, which may have been why his resolve was slipping. That his entire career he had worked with some of the most beautiful women in Hollywood, turning them into the biggest stars in Hollywood, and he both wanted them and didn't. His own wife was. They stayed married. She was very down to earth. She was a huge help to him. She was a sort of unsung organizer, and he took her advice more than anyone else. And they met on the film set in his 20s when he was in London, and she was some kind of script director there. But they met there, and she was a crucial part of his life for his entire career and until his death. So there's a kind of so Hitchcock's also Scotty. You get the chasm the movie is trying to bridge within Hitchcock, and the 2 points where the bridge is secured is Scotty and Gavin Elster. The Hitchcock who was completely in control making the movie, and then the Hitchcock who was an insecure, overweight, kind of nerdy boy who married a somewhat maternal-looking figure and has these terrifying mother figures in many of his movies. I mean, one anecdote: his mother was a very strict Catholic, and he was expected to, at the end of every day, at his bedtime, or hers, I forget, he would have to stand at the foot of the bed and recite any sins that he had committed that day. So that alone could give you the beginnings of mother figures like Mrs. Bates in Psycho, or even Midge, she's clearly not a Mrs. Bates, but you see in this case Scotty / Johnny. He's got 3 different names really. That he has denied dependence on Midge, and I think he rejects her all the time really, and when Midge tries to cross the line by finding the painting of what Carlotta Valdez looks like, the woman who's supposedly haunting Madeline, whom Johnny is in love with, she repaints the portrait that's hanging in the Legion Museum, and she puts her own face in place of Carlotta, or in this case perhaps Kim Novak, and she doesn't realize that there's, I don't have time to go through the scenes it's suggested, but you get the feeling that they may have consummated their affair. I mean, we see them kissing, and we know that it's nighttime in Midge's apartment when he comes over, and she's left a note under his door, and she hasn't seen him for several days. So it's completely off camera, but it seems unlikely that the relationship hasn't been consummated. And this will become one of the strange points of the movie, because after he thinks she's dead, and after he's had his nervous breakdown, and after he's back out wandering around in kind of a daze, he sees this woman who reminds him of Madeline, even though she's a girl from Kansas. She shows him her driver's license. Her name is Judy Barton, but it is the woman who had been Gavin Elster's mistress, who did play Madeline. And most viewers, and if you've watched this without my spoiler, I'm curious, don't even notice that Kim Novak, who plays both Judy and Madeline, when viewers seeing the movie for the first time see Judy, they don't say, "Oh my God, that's the woman who played Madeline." She's not wearing a bra. She doesn't have the suspended bridge bra. She has brown hair, kind of thicker eyebrows, green sweater. She's dressed totally different, and she doesn't have that mysterious, dreamy air that she perfected while playing um, uh, Madeline Elster. And you know, this movie is obviously about movies too. Like we didn't when we watched Madeline, we kind of we became drawn to this character, Madeline, this kind of lost, possibly possessed or mentally ill woman who was the wife of Gavin Elster. So we were fooled. Judy fooled us too in the first half of the movie, and then in the second, well, not even half, but in the first 2/3 of the movie, and then in the last third of the movie, he wants to take her out and to date her, and the to double up the irony, while she was pretending to be Madeline Elster, whom he fell in love with her, she, Judy, fell in love with him, Scotty. And but he loves Madeline, who is her, except not. And this gets at the impossibility of femininity, which we saw Esther struggle with in the bell jar, that a woman is told to masquerade as Madeline, as feminine and sexy and mysterious. And then if she does that and does it well, then a man will fall in love with that performance. But then it's the in plaster problem that then the Judy inside the performance of femininity feels unseen and unloved. And how does a woman find this balance? Midge is trying to, it's really kind of making a feminist statement. 1959, 4 years before the feminine mystique, she paints her face into this masquerade of femininity, and because she doesn't masquerade as feminine for Johnny, he's not interested, and she doesn't seem interested either. It's in many ways she seems like an independent, you know, career woman. Like she has work. She went to art school. She pays the bills by doing ad copy. She's got her own apartment. She's not dependent on a man. She's not married. She doesn't have children. So in some ways, she's in that image that Esther Greenwood, you know, going into New York to be an editor, to make her own way. But like the women Esther sees at the magazine, the editor JC and so on, Midge, although this movie is ultimately not her story, she's got that same pick the fig problem. Like she's got a career, she's got her independence, she's got her apartment, but she doesn't have a marriage, she doesn't have children, she doesn't have a man, and she doesn't really know. It's been frustrating to her in her life that even when she wishes she could, she seems unable to masquerade as feminine. So this attempt to paint her face into the masquerade of femininity obviously is jarring and really upsetting to Johnny, because he's in love with this fantasy of the performance of femininity, which is literally a performance by Judy, not to mention Kim Novak. And there's nothing more convincing that something's real as when you perform it, because then you can perform it as real, and it looks more real than when you're not. Midge is very real, but she's invisible, and Madeline is completely fabricated and dominates the screen, dominates what we see in the audience, dominates what Johnny and as Scotty wants. There's nothing more. The most powerful presentations of reality are performative. Realities that aren't performed don't make an impression, and so that can cut both ways with Barbie and Ken. So that it's the performance that we see, and the performance gives us the fantasy that can, like in the balcony, can make our reality seem more real. So she's this fantasy victim and makes him kind of regain his masculinity, because he's the one who follows, he's the one who rescues, he's the one who watches over, he's the one who explains, and it gives him back his own certainty, his own conviction, until that body drops off the tower, and then he loses it all. He's basically catatonic, and then he bumps into a woman who reminds him of the woman he once had, so he thinks, that made him feel whole, coherent, a man, his Godot, if you will. I mean, what's weird about Vertigo is Godot comes every single day, but he also drops off a tower at the end. So, which is different than never coming, But in the end, no more satisfying. And perhaps kind of worse. It's hard to say. I'd be curious what you guys thought of that. Is it better to have your Godot come and be revealed as a fantasy, or to have them never arrive and still? Because actually, part of what crushes Scotty when he finds out that Judy is the one who played Madeline is he loses his loss. Now he can't even mourn the death of the great love of his life, Madeline, because there is no Madeline. And and yet he keeps saying, "I love Madeline. I loved you so." Looking right at Judy, who's the woman who played Madeline, and he doesn't. He's not interested in Judy sexually. It's just as bad as it was with Midge. She's throwing herself at him. She would love for him to take her to bed as Judy, so she could break the spell. And she has the exact same body. So if sex was about bodily attraction, this movie doesn't make any sense. She has a nice body. She has the same body, but she's not. It's not the same performance. We approach our lovers often through fantasy, and what makes them attractive to us is partly what we deposit in them, and they do the same with us. And it's not necessarily pernicious. It's a question of how you manage it. And part of what attracts us to someone is a way they evoke our own past. Um, and the movie's very much about that too, the way the past is always haunting your present. So there is no Carlotta Valdez haunting Judy, but she seems to be haunted by something. I mean, we get little details like the fact that she left Kansas. She said because my mom remarried and I didn't like the guy. And it's kind of a throwaway line, but it's easy to read more into that. I mean, she left home and doesn't seem to have any intention of going back, and has a photograph of her mom and her dad, not the new guy. So she seems to have cut all ties. And it's in 1959, people didn't talk about it very much, but it's quite possible this new guy that her mother married showed a keen interest in her, and she didn't. And then I'm making this up right now, but it would be a very typical story that then the daughter would complain to the mother that the mother's new husband is coming into her room or coming in the bathroom and spying, and then the mother's either going to throw the guy out or it's going to say stop having a dirty mind and stop fantasizing about this. And if you're old enough as a woman and you're in that situation, you can't get your mother to support you, and the guy won't stop, then you leave. I mean, it's much tougher if you're 10 or 15, but she was old enough to come to San Francisco, get a job in a department store, and then was taken up by Gavin Elster. Now, Carlotta Valdez was a real person, and so the story goes, a powerful businessman, and nobody can remember who, saw her dancing at the chapel, the place that Judy slash Madeline will bring Scotty to later, and he sort of fell in love with her. He was already married, so but he was a powerful man, and so he took her as a mistress. He had a house built for her. It's now called the McKittrick Hotel, and it's one of the places that Judy Madeline is told to haunt. She goes there every day, sits in the window, leaves. And that used to be Carlotta Valdez's home, and that part's true. But Elster has insinuated this story, and of course, Elster is the new version of the wealthy businessman who takes a mistress. So Judy, in a sense, is Carlotta Valdez. With the difference being that Carlotta Valdez had a baby from the wealthy man, and as the fellow at the old bookstore puts it, he kept the baby and threw her away. Men could do it in those days. They were powerful, and Gavin Elster says almost the exact same thing to Scotty when they first meet. I miss the old San Francisco. Men were powerful then. So there is a kind of, well, on the one hand, is Elster claims to be nostalgic for make men great again. But he is the exact same as that guy 100 years ago. There's no child involved, unless you want to count Scotty, and that's an intriguing possibility. But what happened to that child? No one seems to remember the name of this businessman. It seems unlikely that Scotty is the son of Carlotta Valdez, but in this movie, in the surrealistic swirl, so much is possible. So the so that the last 45 minutes of the movie is we know that this is the Judy who played Madeline. Scotty only knows that she reminds him of Madeline. Judy knows what Scotty doesn't know and what we know. And what she wants to do is get him to fall in love with her as Judy. But well, the only reason he wants to take her to dinner or anywhere else is, and he takes her to Ernie's, of course, and then later she'll ask to go to Ernie's. But she wants to make Ernie's the place that she and where Judy and Scotty fell in love. But she's a ghost. Judy's now a ghost who's haunting uh, the his own fantasy of bringing Madeline back to life by persuading Judy to dress up like Madeline. Now he thinks he's just found a woman who looks like Madeline and can manage to do it. Uh, she, of course, has got a lot of problems with this. One is that if she does and she perfectly becomes Madeline, it's quite possible that he will realize that she's not just some woman who looks like Madeline. She is the woman who pretended to be Madeline. And although this reveal occurs because she carelessly puts on a necklace, which is part of the painting, and presumably Gavin Elster had a version of the necklace made up, but for some reason she never wore the necklace. Uh, and in all her time with Scotty, and and then when on this night of all nights, after they've clearly consummated the relationship again, because you have this whole sort of 1950s post-coital scene where he's just sitting there all relaxed. He's like, "Hi, honey," and she comes breezing out of the bathroom. So he's finally made love to her again. And when she completely became Madeline, and he wants her sexually, passionately, and when we can see the very strange kiss where they're turning and turning. And at one point, the room turns back into the stable, which is where they had their last kiss. And Hitchcock actually put Stewart and Novak on a carousel to shoot that scene. And he had the carousel turning in one direction and the camera moving in the other to create the vertigo effect. So the vertigo effect is terrifying and exhilarating. It's that moment where you either look over the bridge secure and with a sense that there's no way you can fall into the void, or it's terrifying because the bridge starts to give and you realize you're crumbling into the void, and the movie will end. Well, hold on, let me get to that. But so he's going to push her more and more into becoming Madeline. And this is where I think Hitchcock's knowledge of fascism and Hitler and totalitarianism and patriarchy and toxic masculinity are all coming to bear, because Scotty seems like a nice guy by any version of things. But when he loses his bridge and sees a chance to build it back, he paves over Judy. He's murdering her in a way. I mean, that's not the way he would see it, but even saying, uh, let's say that he doesn't think this is the woman who played uh, Madeline, but she's somebody, and he wants to entomb her in the performance of Madeline. And in a way, it gets even more complicated than that, because you do get the feeling, like at one point he says to her, well, after he's bought her the dresses in this very coercive way, taking to the department store, and Hitchcock said he essentially wanted to film that scene like a rape, where every time she runs away, he grabs her and makes her come back and look at the dress again. And as if, buying that dress and addressing her, oddly enough, is like ripping off her dress. And Hitchcock liked to point out that in this final scene, near final scene, where she comes back and she still has her hair down because her hair it hasn't been put in the vertigo swirl. And he's like, "What's that?" I told them the hair, and again, if everything isn't perfect, nothing is. And she says, "Well, it just didn't look right." And she's trying to hang on to that. And he's like, "Please, Judy, please." So she says, "Okay." And as Hitchcock pointed out to Truffaut in a famous interview, the French director Truffaut, he said, "It's a reverse striptease. The more clothes she puts on, the more naked he sees her. The more she becomes an exciting naked Madeline." So as she walks toward him fully dressed, it's filmed more like the scene where the woman would go in the bathroom and take clothes off and either emerge in lingerie or nothing at all, and that would commence the erotic. what's erotic is that she could put on more clothes, but that's Hitchcock's way of emphasizing that it's the fantasy that drives the eroticism, and not the anatomical body. Obviously, you know, the difference in bodies can be attracting, but we're not equally attracted to every body of whatever sex we desire. And that's not strictly based on measurements either. So part of erotic attraction is the feasibility of seeing some of the fantasy elements our reality requires as being somehow embedded or embodied in the other person. And they might do the same, as I said, for us. So, but I want to look at I do want to try and look at some clips here. So last time I shared my screen, I noticed in 2001, you got the audio and not the image, I think, and that's kind of awkward. I think my points were still made sense in a way because I was narrating shot by shot, and you could probably find on the film where I was. So, but I just need to see if I can do it this time in a way that, and I don't know how to test it as I'm doing it. So let's just hope. So I want to share the application screen, and so I do that, and oh yeah, and I just remembered that I'm on Safari, which doesn't always do this right. So, in fact, I don't think it's gonna let me share the screen. Okay. So we'll do more. That means I'll try and share the screen for our open classroom, which is tomorrow night. And I won't belabor the point here. But what I want you to, a couple other things I'll mention as you observe things for yourself. Almost every scene in this movie has a canny scene and an uncanny scene. So, you know, when after she jumps in the bay, he brings her home and he undresses her. So we've actually already seen her naked. She puts her dress to dry. She pretends to be unconscious the whole time. We don't know that the first time we see the movie. So when you see the movie again, and if possible, and I probably won't have time to do this before Monday night, but at least watch the first hour and 20 minutes again, because you'll have that double consciousness of every single scene is both what you thought it was and not that at all. So you think he's carrying an unconscious woman, and in fact, she's just pretending to be unconscious. That means she's pretending to be unconscious while he takes off all her clothes. And then she wakes up, quote unquote, and she has to pretend to not know how she got there. And at one point, Scotty says, "Do you do this often?" Meaning, do you jump in the bay often? And she understandably thinks he's asking, do you often wake up in a man's bed and not know how you got there? So there's that alcohol suggestion again. She doesn't drink, as far as one can tell. But the way Hitchcock films this, it's, you know, would you call a doctor if a woman is unconscious for that long? What else is going on in this scene? I mean, is this? I mean, there's an uneasy echoing here of, and I know there's a TV show with Carey Mulligan. I haven't seen it, but I gather the hook is some woman who pretends to be super drunk, and then some guy takes her home thinking this is his lucky night, and then she's completely sober. That's all I know. I'm planning to check it out, but I haven't seen it. If any of you guys have, I'd be curious. But because this scene is shot with that, again, without any alcohol, like one of those things where you drink till blackout and you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I went home with this guy. You know, where am I? And then you run out the door, like, which is exactly what she does. But there's supposedly this other explanation, and you know, this is where the movie seems really surreal, because Gavin Elster keeps ringing the phone. It's the last time we'll even hear from him, and Scotty's acting like a physician. He's like, no, it's all right. She's here. She's fine. Now she doesn't know anything. And it's like, what are you guys talking about? You know, how can there? And it's one of those. The surreal element of this movie is, are we inside the split mind of someone who is both Gavin Elster and Scotty, the way Vladimir and Estragon seem to be two halves of the same person. We see that a lot in these uncanny movies. I've talked about that with Nightmare on Elm Street or Psycho or The Shining, for that matter. There seem to be often in horror movies, we part of the hook is that there is more than one person inside us. And we think we know everything about ourselves, and in fact we know maybe half, and then that other half is hidden, and that's the drive, that's the drama behind anxiety and depression and exhilaration and violence and love and tenderness, is that divide between who we think we are and the leftover that we ignore in order to believe in a totality that is only half of what we have. This was, color movies also came in quite a bit after sound, but primarily in the 50s. And Hollywood was anxious to move into color movies quickly because television had arrived and they were terrified that television might cause people to no longer go to the theater. And since television was still black and white and probably would be for at least in the decade, movies had a way they did two things. They widened the screen and they invented Technicolor. So it made them a little more secure that they could still be something apart and other than television, because they were much wider screen, much better sound. And, movies have continued to, now they're fighting big screens. You can get screens that are 60 inches or so, 70 inches. You can have a home theater now in a way that you couldn't have back then. You can have sound that rivals a movie theater. And Lord knows we have enough problems to talk about, but movie theaters have been dealt a massive blow by COVID. There's no reason movie theaters can't do takeout. They can't rearrange things. They can't do curbside delivery. It's a giant place with with rent that's vacant except for images that flicker on a screen. It's really weird and eerie how movie theaters have just gone dark in COVID, and no one's. I mean, there were already people were. I think they were starting to lose attendance, except for maybe movies like a new Star Wars, something like that. But I mean, Netflix or Disney, I guess, is doing The Mandalorian, and they're bringing the franchise onto the television set. Anyway, I'm trying to teach intro to film here with one movie, but you'll notice the way Hitchcock uses the color red and the color green. Throughout the movie, red, it means passion, fantasy, excitement, anticipation. And green is like a warning that this exciting reality isn't real. So the most obvious scene, perhaps, is late in the movie when she finally comes out of the bathroom, having agreed to fully become Madeline again, and you can hardly see her. She's in this green fog, and it looks to the Empire Hotel, which is where her room is, has a green neon sign. So loosely speaking, you could argue, oh, it's the green neon sign, but it's also not. I mean, it's obviously way more than that neon sign could possibly be doing. Whereas Ernie's is bright red, the wallpaper is red. Even Midge wears a red shirt in the scene where she's going to try and paint herself into the painting of Carlotta Valdez. Correspondingly, the first time he sees Judy on the street, she's wearing a green sweater. So it's not rigid, but you can ask yourself, what's green doing in the set scene, the mise en scène, as the French call it, and what's red doing? And when they're in the redwood forest, it's where she runs to the ocean, and they have their first kiss against the crashing water. And but finally, she said, "Oh, Scotty, I do have you now." But then she puts the necklace on, and it's really hard to figure out, like, what was Judy thinking. And not only does she pull out the necklace that would give away that no woman who didn't play Madeline would have this necklace, she puts it, and then she can't get it to clasp in the back, and she's, would you help me put it on? And he comes over to do that, and he's looking at the clasp, uh, and saying, how do you do this? And she says, can't you see? And then he looks up, and then he sees the portrait essentially in the mirror, and the reflected in the mirror is the necklace. And then he has a flashback to sitting in front of the portrait, and Hitchcock cuts back and forth the realization comes crashing in on Scotty. And then he changes very subtly, and he's like, I don't think I want to go to Ernie's. I think I want to drive down the peninsula a little ways. And we in the audience, we now know that Scotty has caught up to us, but now Judy doesn't know it. So once, throughout the movie, each of them hold a piece of the truth that the other doesn't know. Scotty doesn't say she's a detective. She doesn't say, I'm actually Judy from Kansas. Then he thinks she is Judy from Kansas, but she doesn't say that I'm the one who played Madeline. And he doesn't say, I want you to be this woman who, in fact, you were. It's an infinite loop, and it's exactly what I've been talking about the entire class about postmodernism. Like, where's the referent? Where's the signifier? Where's that Godot influence that can tell us that something is something all the time, and not just when it's in relation to something else. So he drives her to the peninsula, and he's pretty quiet, and it's the same drive they made earlier, except it's the opposite. And this movie does this over again. You get the same shot, same scene, shot twice. Kubrick does this in The Shining, where you have the ordinary hotel by day, and then you have the hotel as Jack Torrance is going increasingly mad. But here they're on the same road. They're driving on the wrong side of the road. It's a funny little Hitchcock almost joke, because it's literally the inverse of the last time they were driving on that road. And last time she was in control. She had power, if you will, because she had persuaded him that it was his idea to go see this chapel. But it's all set up. He's in a movie and he doesn't know it, so to speak. And although Jimmy Stewart knows it, but his character Scotty doesn't. And but she's getting nervous because where are they going? And of course, she's starting to realize where they're going, but she doesn't want to say, wait, we've been here before, because that would reveal that she's in fact the woman who played Madeline. And so she has to continue to be Judy until they're there. And she's like, what are you doing? What, and he says, I just need you to be Madeline a little longer, Judy. And he's like, the necklace, Judy. That was your mistake, the necklace. And going back, was that her mistake? I mean, yes, but it's such a ridiculous mistake. It's such a surreal mistake that it demands a psychological reading that is her final protest, her final acting out. Judy's final acting out is to trick Madeline in a way. Like, Madeline wasn't thinking. Madeline put on Madeline's necklace. And then Judy, who's now trapped inside of Madeline, is like, aha, I gotcha. And Judy wins. Judy kills Madeline. But now Scotty wants to kill Judy, perhaps. It's unclear, but there's something murderous. And the other weird thing is now, although we didn't see the scene where Gavin Elster dragged the body of his dead wife up the stairs, it must have looked something very like this. So in another way, it's like, is this Gavin Elster going up the stairs? Is this Scotty being possessed by Gavin Elster? Because he talks a lot about Gavin Elster as he drags her up the stairs. Like, so he dressed you, didn't he? And he taught you how to walk like that. And he taught you how to do those dreamy trances, just like I did, only better. And suddenly he's locked in this competition with Gavin Elster, like Gavin Elster created Madeline, generated the Madeline that he fell in love with. And if you go back to the scene where he first meets Gavin Elster, Hitchcock is at pains to shoot that so that Scotty often looks like a little boy. So he's got in a way, Scotty also has parents in this movie. He has Midge and he has Gavin Elster, the stern, coercive father, and the smothering, suffocating mother, and in between the insecure little boy trying to be a man, Scotty. So watch that scene, and you'll see, like Scotty sits in the corner at one point in the chair with a high angle shot. The room is set up so that there's a step up that. Speaking of Vertigo, is a step up that Gavin Elster can take, so he's literally looking down on Scotty. He stands behind Scotty while Scotty's sitting at another point. So he's visually, Gavin Elster's dominating him at every point. And, we could do a Freudian reading too, that Scotty is haunted by imagos of his parents, of his suffocating mother and his emotionally unavailable patriarchal father. And Madeline is his fantasy of overcoming those parental imagos and becoming a man, an independent man, but he needs a particular kind of performance from a woman. And it seems that Gavin Elster knows that. I mean, because the other scene that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I mean, the chances that Gavin Elster takes for this crazy murder plot, if you really try to look at it practically, it's the most insane murder plot ever, and in the way it should have worked. There's so many places it could have gone wrong, and it's a tribute to the dream fever dream quality of things that Scotty gets rushed past all this, and so do we as an audience. What a convoluted way to kill somebody, and involving all these other people. And then, I mean, not only is it cruel to use Judy and Scotty, but although Judy's morally ambiguous in a way that the movie seems to also ask us to rush past. I mean, we're given no scenes between Judy and Gavin, and I think part of the reason is it would make it a lot harder to maintain sympathy if we saw her plotting. All she says is it wasn't supposed to happen this way, and I suppose that would probably be her excuse. Why did you go along with this? And you claim you fell in love with Scotty, and you kept on doing this. Why? And her defense, I imagine, would be, you weren't supposed to fall in love with me. I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. You were just supposed to be a detective who, unfortunately, your disability came up at the wrong moment, and you'd be upset about that on a kind of personal, professional level. But Gavin would be like, don't worry about it. We both know what really killed her. It wasn't your fault. It could all work out, except that she fell in love with how desperately he loved Madeline, and he fell in love with Madeline, and so he can't love her, even though she loves him. It really kind of leaves you asking, how does anybody love anybody? And when they do, who are they loving? There's a great surrealist, Andre Breton, who says, rather than ask whom do you love, ask who is it that haunts me. I'll let you ponder that. It's not strictly part of the lecture, but I'm going to wind it up here because I don't have a screen sharing capacity with this particular, but sometimes that's better. This way you're the scene readers, and when we come here on Monday, I'd invite whoever comes here, or if you're going to watch the recording, you can send me a note if there's a scene you particularly want me to talk about. You can either tell me live on Monday, or you could send me a note, leonardgary@hotmail.com. I'd like to look at the shopping scene in some detail. I'd like to look at the scene with the reveal with the necklace. And you can tell me if there's something else you want me to pay attention to. I posted a somewhat impressionistic in the discussion section where I put together some of the images that are actually separated by 20, 30, 40 minutes in the movie, just so you could see the relentless parallelism that's going on. So have a look at that too. Oh, and just to complete my thought about Gavin Elster is, it's so weird when he says to him, you don't have to decide now. We're dining tonight at Ernie's. Come and see her, and then you can decide. What a weird thing to say. What does that have to do with the business end of what's just been discussed? I need you to follow my wife. Come see her and then decide. I mean, he's offering the guy his wife in a way, and also he's going to frame Gavin Elster, the director, is going to frame this in such a way that that she will be stunning. And yet, how does he know? How does he know so well what Scotty wants? It's as if he knows a part of Scotty better, and that then Scotty knows that part of himself. The same one that offers Scotty a drink, the guy who says, Scotty, I need a friend, someone I can trust. Well, what a despicable thing to say when, you know, he's not a friend, Gavin. He's not trustworthy. And in fact, he's going to crassly manipulate Scotty. Uh, because the other moral thing that is slipped past in the movie, doesn't seem to be able to get any traction in this movie, is Scotty never seems to even debate whether it's all right to sleep with this married woman that he's actually been hired to follow around by a worried husband. Accept the story at face value. Then what he's doing is, well, it's professionally unethical. It's personally unethical. Obviously, it's a betrayal of Gavin Elster. Well, it would be if Gavin Elster wasn't already betraying the hell out of Scotty. And you know, because at one point in the scene after he drags her out of from her plunge into the bay, she says, "I'm married, you know," and he ignores it completely. And then in the scene where she comes back with the note to thank him for the other day, which is also part of the plan, so he actually trails her back to his own house, and he says, "Well, where are you going?" And she says, "Oh, I'm just wandering." And she says, "Well, I'm going to go wandering too. Why don't we wander together?" And she said, "Well, when two people wander together, they're going somewhere." And he says, "No, I don't think so." And that kind of, but she's basically warning him. I mean, that this is a pivotal moment in the movie where she's saying, "If you get in this car, uh, we are not two wanderers. We're a couple, and we'll be, and then we'll be going somewhere." Uh, Part of her seems to be warning him to, and how could Gavin Elster know, or did he, or did it? Maybe this wasn't a requirement of the plot, although that you know, he did send her. It can't have been her idea to go back with the thank you note. That was part of Gavin Elster's trying to make sure that he had a chance to. You know, he keeps dangling. He's almost like a pimp. I mean, he keeps putting his wife, you know, jump in the bay, let him take your clothes off, go back and do a thank you note, let him get in the car with you. And part of her is falling in love with him. The Judy wants him to get in the car, but the Judy that's falling in love with him also is starting to feel like somebody in a movie theater watching a man make a mistake. You know, you're going deeper and deeper into Gavin Elster's plot, and I'm falling in love with you as Judy, and you're falling in love with Madeline, and I want to warn you. And she's almost got the same problem that Midge had, which is Judy wants to be with Scotty on any terms, just like Midge did. And part of this is traceable to Scotty because he does have these really, in many masculine performers, feminine performers, we get into this role playing where we audition people for, we don't mean to necessarily, but we audition them for a role in our fantasy scenario, which underwrites our reality, which is what holds up the suspension bridge above the void of our own incertitude. All right. I think I'm going to end on that because I like the sound of it. I will see you Monday night at 7:30, and I'll have the right screen thing up here, and we'll go from there. Okay. Enjoy spring. I think we had an amazing Sunday. Was amazing, and it looks like the week going forward is going to be a nice taste of spring, even if we get slapped in the face again, which March and early April can do. So I'm not going to fall in love with spring yet because that's going to, you know, turn back into Judy or something. Although I don't, that's not a question for you guys. I liked Judy better than Madeline. But despite also her own moral failings, it's an interesting discussion. Like, isn't there some point she could have said, you know, by the way, Gavin Elster's planning to kill his wife, especially if she was falling in love with Scotty. Why not save Gavin Elster's wife, and she and Scotty can get married? All right, I'll leave you to ponder that, and I will see you